Open any European atlas from the 17th century. Flip past the Mediterranean coastlines, past the familiar contours of France and the Iberian Peninsula, past Russia and Poland, and you will eventually arrive at a vast, largely featureless expanse that stretches from the Ural Mountains all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Across that immense territory, cartographers wrote a single name: Tartary. The label was not modest. It covered millions of square kilometers. It appeared on maps produced in Amsterdam, Paris, London, and Lisbon. It was referenced in encyclopedias, diplomatic dispatches, and travel literature for several centuries. In some atlases, Tartary was subdivided. There was Muscovite Tartary, Independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, but the root word remained constant, and the scale of the territory it described was, by any measure, continental. Now, consider what is absent from those same maps. Every named empire of that era has a capital, a dot, a symbol, a label marking the seat of power. Constantinople anchors the Ottoman world. Vienna grounds the Habsburg domains. Beijing, then often rendered as Peking or Cambalo, marks the center of Chinese imperial authority. But on maps of Tartary, there is no such dot. There is no administrative center, no seat of government, no city singled out as the place where decisions were made and authority resided. That absence raises a question. If Tartary was understood to be a political or imperial entity, and many historical texts treated it as such, then where was its capital? And if it had no capital, what exactly was it? This documentary investigates that question, not as a mystery in the sensational sense, but as a genuine historical and cartographic puzzle, one that's, when carefully examined, tells us something important about the limits of early modern European knowledge, the nature of steppe political organization, and the way geographical labels have always been as much about the map maker as about the territory being mapped. To understand why Tartary appears the way it does on early modern maps, we need to understand how those maps were made, and, crucially, what cartographers were actually trying to communicate. European cartography entered a period of rapid transformation in the 15th and 16th centuries. The rediscovery and translation of Ptolemy's Geographia in the early 1400s provided a mathematical framework for representing the spherical Earth on a flat surface. The Portuguese and Spanish voyages of exploration began filling in coastlines that had previously existed only as speculation. The printing press, from the mid-15th century onward, allowed maps to be reproduced and distributed in ways that manuscripts never permitted. But the transformation of cartographic knowledge was deeply uneven. Coastlines, accessible to ships, were mapped with increasing precision. Interiors were another matter entirely. For much of Asia, and especially for the interior of the Eurasian landmass, European cartographers depended not on first-hand survey, but on a patchwork of travelers' accounts, diplomatic reports, merchant narratives, and older geographic traditions, many of them derived ultimately from classical sources or early medieval itineraries. When Joan Blau produced his monumental Atlas Maier in 1662, it was the largest and most expensive printed book of its era. It contained some of the most detailed maps of Europe then available, but its treatment of Inner Asia reflected precisely this uneven state of knowledge. Tartary was marked as a vast region, subdivided loosely, with no clear internal hierarchy of cities or administrative centers. Blau was not incompetent. He was working with what existed. The Venetian cartographer Fra Mauro, whose extraordinary world map of around 1450 represents perhaps the most ambitious geographical synthesis of the medieval period, included substantial information about the Mongol successor territories based on merchants' and missionaries' accounts. But even his sophisticated effort shows how difficult it was to impose clear political structure on a world where structure was organized differently than Europeans were used to. What cartographers could do and did when faced with large unknown or poorly documented regions was to assign a general ethnic or cultural label to the space and move on. This practice was not unique to Tartary. Africa was for centuries little more than a continental label on maps where the interior was almost entirely blank or filled with inherited classical speculation. Terra Australis Incognita was a theoretical continent that appeared on maps for nearly 200 years before it was either confirmed or refuted by exploration. The label Tartary, in other words, functioned not as the name of a state with defined institutions, but as a geographic holding term, a way of acknowledging that a large and significant part of the world existed, was inhabited by identifiable cultural groups, and had some political organization, without being able to specify exactly what that organization looked like. But this explanation, while accurate, does not quite settle the question, because some cartographers did attempt to impose more structure. Some maps show cities within Tartary, some show regional subdivisions, and the larger encyclopedic tradition of early modern Europe consistently used the language of empire and dominion when referring to Tartary. The Encyclopedia of Diderot and d'Alembert, that monument of Enlightenment knowledge, described Tartary as a country of vast extent, listing its parts and their approximate boundaries. It did not describe it as a fiction. So here is the first productive contradiction. The cartographic record is clear that Tartary had no single marked capital, but the textual record consistently treated it as something more than a mere geographical expression. How do we reconcile those two things? To understand Tartary, you have to start with the Mongols and with the name that Europeans attached to them. The Mongol conquests of the 13th century were, by any measure, one of the most dramatic geopolitical events in human history. In the space of roughly 5 decades, Mongol armies under Genghis Khan and his successors shattered the political order across an enormous arc of territory stretching from the Pacific coast of China through Central Asia, Persia, and the Caucasus into Russia and Eastern Europe. Kingdoms that had stood for centuries collapsed in months. Cities that were among the largest in the medieval world were reduced to rubble. Europe, on the periphery of this cataclysm, received news of it in fragments, fearful, often garbled, passed through chains of informants and translators. The people doing the conquering were identified by a variety of names. Mongol was one. Tartar, sometimes Tatar, was another, derived from the name of a specific Turkic-Mongolic tribal group, the Tatars, who had been one of the peoples absorbed into and subordinated by Genghis Khan's expanding confederation. In the Latin West, the name underwent a telling transformation. It was conflated with Tartarus, the classical underworld, producing the Latin form Tartari, the people from hell. The apocalyptic imagery was deliberate. But here is where things become historically complicated. The Tartars of European imagination were never quite the same as any specific historical people. Over the course of the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, the label was progressively expanded and generalized. It came to apply not just to Mongols or Tatars in a strict ethnographic sense, but to a vast range of Turkic and Mongolic peoples across the Eurasian steppe, Cumans, Kipchaks, Uzbeks, Kazakhs, and many others, and eventually to any population of the interior Asian landmass that was not clearly Chinese, Persian, Indian, or Russian. This process of conceptual expansion is crucial. Tartar, and by extension Tartary, was never a precise ethnic or political term. It was a category of convenience, applied from outside, by people who needed some way to talk about an enormous and diverse set of populations that they understood imperfectly. Now, the Mongol Empire itself did have capitals, and they are historically documented. Genghis Khan established his primary administrative center at Karakorum, in present-day central Mongolia, around 1220. The city was developed substantially under his successor, Oghine Khan.
the Franciscan friar William of Rubruck, who traveled to the Mongol court in the 1250s on a diplomatic mission for the French king Louis IX, left a detailed account of Karakorum, its layout, its population, its markets, its cosmopolitan character. It was a real city, a functioning administrative center, and it was known to at least some European observers. After the fracturing of the unified Mongol Empire into its successor khanates, the Golden Horde in the west, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China, each of these successor states developed its own administrative centers. Sarai, on the lower Volga, became the Golden Horde's capital. Tabriz and later Sultaniya were centers of the Ilkhanate. The Yuan dynasty maintained its capital at Khanbalik, the city that Marco Polo described in detail and that became, under the Ming, the Beijing we know today. These capitals were known. They appeared in various forms in European sources. Marco Polo's account, whatever its particular interpretive complications, gave European readers a reasonably detailed picture of the Yuan court and its administrative geography. The Golden Horde's capital on the Volga was mentioned in numerous diplomatic and merchant sources. But here is the critical point. By the time the term Tartary had become fully stabilized as a cartographic label, roughly the late 16th century, the unified Mongol Empire was 200 years in the past. The successor khanates had themselves fragmented, been absorbed by other powers, or transformed almost beyond recognition. What remained across the Eurasian steppe was a complex mosaic of smaller polities, tribal confederations, and gradually shrinking domains, many of them nominally claiming descent from the Chinggisid line, but politically very different from the empire that line had once governed. So when a cartographer in Amsterdam in 1650 wrote Tartary across half of Asia, he was not describing the Mongol Empire. He was using a name that had once been associated with Mongol power and subsequently become a geographical placeholder for a region that was real, inhabited, and politically organized, but organized in ways that did not produce the kind of clear administrative hierarchy, the single dominant city that European geographers were equipped to recognize and represent. This brings us to perhaps the most substantive part of this investigation, not how Europeans imagined the steppe, but how political power on the steppe actually functioned. The concept of a capital, a fixed city where a government resides, where records are kept, where the sovereign holds permanent court, is not a universal feature of political organization. It's a specific model, developed most fully in sedentary agricultural civilizations, where dense population, permanent infrastructure, and agricultural surplus make the concentration of administrative functions in a single place both possible and useful. Steppe polities operated on a fundamentally different logic. The ecological basis of life across the Eurasian steppe was pastoral nomadism, the seasonal movement of herds, horses, cattle, sheep, goats, camels, across vast distances, following grazing patterns dictated by the rhythms of the seasons. This way of life shaped not just economics, but politics. Leaders who could not move with their people, who were anchored to a single city, were leaders who were losing touch with the primary source of their power, the mobile, armed, horse-mounted population that formed the basis of any steppe army. The result was what historians of Inner Asia describe as a mobile court. The Khan, or whatever title the leader used, traveled with his administration. The Ordu, from which we derive the English word horde, literally meant camp or headquarters. It was a moving administrative center, a collection of yurts, attendants, advisors, treasury, records, and court ceremony that relocated with the ruler's movements. When the Khan held audience or issued decrees, he did so from his Ordu, wherever it happened to be at that moment. This does not mean that steppe polities had no cities at all. They frequently did. But the role of cities in steppe states was different from their role in, say, the Ottoman or Chinese empires. Cities on the steppe were often trading centers, winter quarters, religious sites, or places where surplus goods were stored and redistributed. They were nodes in a network, not command centers of a hierarchy. The political authority was vested in the ruler and his court, which moved, not in the city. Karakorum itself illustrates this well. Despite being the designated administrative center of the early Mongol Empire, Karakorum was never a particularly large city by the standards of the sedentary world. William of Rubruck described it as modest compared to the suburb of Saint-Denis near Paris. Its importance was symbolic and functional. It was where the Khan could be found, where goods flowed in and out, where envoys arrived. But when the Khan moved, the effective administrative center moved with him.
This pattern continued in the successor Khanates in the polities that followed them. The Kazakh Khanate, which emerged in the mid-15th century and controlled much of what is now Kazakhstan, had no fixed capital in the sense of a city where an administrative apparatus permanently resided. The Khan moved between seasonal pastures and encampments. The Nogai horde had no city at all in its early centuries. Even the Crimean Khanate, more sedentary than many steppe polities given its semi-agricultural environment, moved its court significantly and maintained power through a combination of military mobility and tributary relationships, rather than through control of a single urban center. Now consider how this appeared to European observers. Diplomats sent to negotiate with steppe leaders found themselves traveling across vast distances, often uncertain exactly where the court was located at any given time. Merchants plying the Silk Road routes encountered shifting centers of authority. Missionaries trying to establish Christian outposts on the steppe found no obvious metropolis to target. The absence of a clear, fixed, locatable capital was not a sign that these polities were primitive or disorganized. It was a consequence of a fundamentally different but internally coherent model of governance. Russian expansion into Siberia, which began in earnest in the late 16th century and continued through the 17th and 18th, provides another illuminating angle. As Russian administrative structures extended eastward, following the rivers, establishing ostrogs or fortified posts, creating a system of tribute collection, they encountered a bewildering variety of political forms. Some Siberian peoples had complex chieftainship structures. Others were organized at the clan or family level with minimal overarching authority. Still others were in the process of political formation or dissolution as the Russian presence disrupted existing balances. The Russian state, for its own administrative purposes, had to impose categories on what it found. The vast territory it was incorporating had to be governed, and governing required classification. Which groups existed, who spoke for them, what tribute was owed, who was responsible for what. The administrative infrastructure that Russia gradually built across Siberia, the voivodeship system, later the gubernia system, was a Russian imposition on top of a pre-existing political landscape that had been organized very differently. From the perspective of a cartographer in Western Europe, this entire process was murky. What reached Amsterdam or Paris was not detailed administrative intelligence, but rough impressions that the Tartars lived across this vast space, that Russian influence was extending into it, that China claimed portions of it, that various unnamed rulers held authority over portions of it. The result on maps was the broad label without the specific capital, because there was genuinely no single specific capital to mark. But we should be careful not to turn this into a simple story of European ignorance encountering steppe complexity. The historical record contains several moments where specific cities were associated with specific steppe polities in ways that could, if the cartographic tradition had developed differently, have produced something more like a marked capital. Let us consider two examples. The first is Samarkand. Under Timur, Tamerlane, who built his empire in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, Samarkand became a genuine imperial capital in the fullest sense, the seat of government, the site of massive architectural investment,
the destination of tribute and captives from across the conquered territories. Timor's Samarkand was described by the Spanish ambassador Ruy González de Clavijo, who visited in 1404, as a great and magnificent city, populous, wealthy, architecturally splendid. This was unambiguously an imperial capital, and Timor's empire was frequently referred to in European sources as part of or adjacent to Tartary. Yet Timor's empire lasted barely a generation in its full extent. After his death in 1405, it fragmented among his descendants. Samarkand remained an important city. It was the capital of the Timurid cultural renaissance in the 15th century, but the Timurid state gradually shrank and eventually was absorbed by the Uzbek Shaibanids in the early 16th century. By the time European cartography was producing its great 17th century atlases, the connection between Samarkand and a unified Tartary had been severed. The second example is Bakhchi-Sarai, the capital of the Crimean Khanate. The Crimean Khanate was a persistent and historically significant polity. A vassal of the Ottoman Empire from 1478 onward, it survived until Russian annexation in 1783. Bakhchi-Sarai was its capital, a real city with a palace complex, administrative structures, and a reasonably clear political identity. European diplomats visited it. It appeared on some maps, but the Crimean Khanate was only one of many entities that were lumped under the broader Tartary label, and its capital did not, in the cartographic imagination, serve as the capital of Tartary as a whole. Now we are in a position to assemble a clear explanation for why no capital appears on maps of Tartary, and why that absence is neither accidental nor mysterious.
The first and most fundamental reason is that Tartary was never a unified political entity with a single administrative center. It was a geographical label that grouped together an enormous and internally diverse collection of peoples, polities, and territories under a single name. No capital appears because there was no single polity to have one. This was not, in the main, a secret hidden from European observers. Educated Europeans in the 17th and 18th centuries knew, at some level, that Tartary was a complex and diverse region. The subdivision of Tartary on maps, Muscovite Tartary, Independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, and so on, reflects awareness that the label was covering a range of different political situations. But that subdivision did not resolve the underlying problem. Each of these zones was itself complex and politically plural, and none had an obvious single capital city. The second reason is the mismatch between European cartographic conventions and the political realities of the steppe. European cartographers, working within a tradition shaped by the mapping of sedentary civilizations, knew how to represent capitals. They had conventions for marking cities, for distinguishing the seat of government from other urban centers, for showing the administrative hierarchy through the size and style of place name labels. Those conventions presupposed a model of government that was tied to a specific place. Steppe political organization, as we have seen, was not tied to a specific place in the same way. The mobile court, the seasonal movement of administrative authority, the distribution of power across a network of tribal leaders rather than its concentration in a single bureaucratic center, all of these features made steppe polities difficult to represent using the conventions available. Cartographers were not, for the most part, ideologically committed to misrepresenting the steppe. They simply lacked the conceptual vocabulary and representational tools to capture it accurately. The third reason is the genuine incompleteness of European information about Inner Asia. Despite the increased flow of travel accounts, diplomatic reports, and missionary correspondence from the 16th century onward, the interior of the Eurasian landmass remained poorly documented by European standards throughout the early modern period. Jesuit missionaries in China accumulated extensive geographical knowledge about Eastern and Northeastern Asia, and some of that knowledge filtered into European cartography. The Jesuit maps of China and Tartary produced in the early 18th century represent a significant improvement in accuracy. But even this improved information came in patches, not as a comprehensive survey. Consider the problem from the perspective of a cartographer working in 1680. He might have access to Russian administrative records that had been partially published or described in travel literature. He might have accounts from Jesuit missionaries who had crossed through portions of Siberia or Mongolia. He might have merchant reports from the caravans that crossed Central Asia, but these sources were inconsistent in their geographic precision, often described different areas at different times, and used place names that did not always correspond to each other. Assembling them into a coherent picture, let alone identifying a single administrative center for Tartary as a whole, was simply not possible given the available evidence. The fourth reason, and perhaps the most intellectually interesting, is that the question, where is the capital, was not one that contemporary steppe political theory would have recognized as meaningful. Capitals are an answer to a question about where power resides. On the steppe, power resided with persons, with khans, with tribal leaders, with military commanders, not with places. The question of where the capital was would have seemed, from within a steppe political culture, somewhat like asking where the most important point on a river is. The question presupposes a kind of geographic fixity that the system does not possess. This is not to romanticize steppe political culture or to suggest it was somehow beyond geographical anchoring. Steppe leaders cared deeply about territory, about grazing rights, about the control of rivers and mountain passes, about access to agricultural tributaries on the periphery of the steppe. But the organization of that territorial concern was different from the way a sedentary empire organized its relationship to its geography. And that difference is precisely what made Tartary so difficult for European cartography to capture in the conventional terms of empire and capital. The question of Tartary's capital has acquired a new life in the Internet era, and it's worth examining that development carefully because it tells us something about how historical maps are now being read. Beginning roughly in the 2010s and accelerating through social media in the late 2019s and 2020s, a cluster of theories emerged online that treated Tartary not as a geographical label of convenience, but as evidence of a suppressed historical empire, a vast, advanced civilization that had allegedly dominated Eurasia and whose memory had supposedly been erased from official history. In some versions of this theory, Tartary was connected to pseudo-historical frameworks involving a mud flood that had supposedly buried entire cities, or to claims that 19th-century architecture styles had been misattributed to a lost Tartarian civilization. These theories drew heavily on old maps, precisely the maps we have been discussing. The existence of Tartary as a label on European atlases was taken as evidence that a real unified empire had once existed. The absence of detailed internal structure of a market capital was reinterpreted not as a consequence of the label's vagueness, but as evidence that something had been deliberately concealed. In this interpretive framework, the absence of a capital became a mystery, and the mystery became evidence of conspiracy. It's important to engage with this development calmly and analytically rather than dismissively. The people drawn to these theories, in many cases, are responding to a genuine sense that official historical narratives are incomplete or that established institutions are not always transparent. The emotional appeal of the idea that large parts of history have been hidden is understandable. And the maps genuinely are remarkable. They do label a vast territory with a single name, and that does invite questions. But the specific historical inferences drawn are not supported by the evidence. We have seen in this documentary that the absence of a market capital on maps of Tartary has a clear and well-documented explanation. It reflects the nature of the label, the political organization of the steppe, and the limitations of European geographical knowledge. There is no gap in the record that requires the hypothesis of deliberate suppression to explain. Moreover, the sources that would need to have been suppressed are themselves extensive and accessible. The Mongol chronicles, the Persian histories of the Ilkhanate and Timurid periods, the Chinese dynastic histories of the Yan and Qing, the Russian administrative records of Siberian expansion, the Jesuit geographical correspondence, the published travel accounts of dozens of European visitors to Central Asia. None of this material has been hidden. It's in libraries, it has been published, much of it has been translated.
The history of the Eurasian steppe is not a secret, it is simply a field of scholarship that requires specialist knowledge to navigate, and that is by its nature less familiar to general audiences than the history of Western Europe. There is also a psychological dimension worth noting. The human mind tends to prefer structured narratives, stories with clear actors, defined places, coherent institutions. An empire with a capital is a familiar structure. An enormous geographic label covering a diverse and politically plural region, used by cartographers who are working at the edge of their knowledge, is a more difficult thing to hold in mind. The impulse to resolve the complexity into a simpler story is understandable, but it is an impulse that historical inquiry is specifically designed to resist.
The more productive question to ask of old maps of Tartary is not where is the hidden capital, but what did this label mean to the people who used it, and what can its use tell us about early modern European geographical knowledge? That question has rich and interesting answers, as we have seen throughout this documentary. We began this investigation with a specific question. If Tartary was a real empire, why does no capital appear in the historical record? The answer, developed across these 40 minutes, resolves into three converging conclusions. The first is that Tartary was not, in any politically precise sense, a real empire. It was a geographic label, a way of naming the vast space of the Eurasian interior that lay beyond the clear boundaries of the Chinese, Russian, Ottoman, Persian, and Indian empires. The label had historical roots in the Mongol conquests of the 13th century and in the ethnic and political entities that had emerged from those conquests. But by the time European cartography had stabilized the use of Tartary as a standard label, it described not a unified polity, but a complex and plural region. It had no capital because it had no government, not because its government had been forgotten or suppressed, but because the label itself was never a precise political term. The second conclusion is that the political organization of the steppe, which the label Tartary was broadly applied to, did not produce the kind of fixed administrative capitals that European cartographic conventions were designed to represent. The mobile court, the distributed power of tribal confederation, the seasonal movements of authority, these were real and functional forms of governance, but they did not produce a city that could be marked on a map as the capital of Tartary. The absence of a marked capital is not evidence of missing information. It is evidence that the political system being mapped did not organize itself in a way that made a capital either necessary or legible. The third conclusion is about the nature of cartographic knowledge itself. Maps are not neutral records of geographical fact. They are arguments, claims about what exists, what matters, how the world is organized. Early modern European maps of Tartary argued, implicitly, that this vast space was unified enough to bear a single name, diverse enough to require subdivision, and important enough to include. What they could not argue, because the evidence was not available and the conceptual tools were not adequate, was that it had a single administrative center. The absence of a capital on those maps reflects the limits of the mapmaker's knowledge and the inadequacy of their conceptual vocabulary for what they were trying to describe. Taken together, these three conclusions suggest something worth sitting with. The search for Tartary's capital, whether conducted by scholars or by internet theorists, is in part a search for a familiar kind of historical entity, the empire, bounded, hierarchical, centered on a capital city. The steppe world that the label Tartary gestured at was organized differently. It was not less complex, not less historically significant, not less deserving of study, but it was different in ways that challenge our default assumptions about what political organization looks like. The historian of Inner Asia, Christopher Beckwith, has argued persuasively that the steppe empires of Eurasia, from the Xiongnu through the Turks and Mongols to the later Khanates, represent a distinct and sophisticated civilizational tradition that has been consistently underestimated in historical writing, shaped by the priorities and perspectives of sedentary civilizations.
Whether or not one accepts all aspects of that argument, its core insight stands. The steppe world cannot be adequately understood using categories developed to describe the sedentary world. The question, where is the capital, is, in the steppe context, at least partly the wrong question. The right questions are different. Who held power, and how was that power transmitted and contested? What held these large, mobile confederations together, and what caused them to fragment? How did steppe polities interact with their sedentary neighbors through trade, tribute, raiding, alliance, and conquest? And how did those interactions shape both the steppe world and the civilizations on its margins? These questions have answers, documented in a rich body of historical sources that historians of Inner Asia have been working with for generations. The cartographic mystery of Tartary's missing capital, examined carefully, dissolves into something more illuminating than a mystery. It becomes a window onto a world that was genuinely different from what European mapmakers were equipped to represent, and, by extension, onto the always provisional nature of geographical knowledge. Every map is a claim about the world made under conditions of incomplete information, using conventions that capture some things and miss others. The great 16th century atlases that labeled half of Asia Tartary were remarkable achievements of their time. They were also, like all maps, the products of specific people in specific places, making the best sense they could of a world that exceeded their grasp. That limitation is not unique to early modern cartography. It is the permanent condition of human knowledge, and recognizing it, in old maps as in everything else, is perhaps the most useful thing that historical inquiry can do. The search for Tartary's capital reveals less about a lost empire than it does about how knowledge is constructed, what gets named, what gets marked, what gets left blank, and what those blanks actually mean.